Welcome, everyone. Thank you for returning as we witness a collision between ancient history and the nightmare of the far future. Today we follow the resurrection of a man who once reshaped a world only to awaken in a galaxy that has forgotten the meaning of peace, Napoleon Bonaparte. Be sure to stay with us until the very final moments of this journey. The truth buried within a corrupted checksum and the fate of the vigilant spire will lead to a revelation that is as agonizing as it is beautiful, a twist that will make you question the very nature of legends in the grim darkness of the future. The story begins right now. Please like and subscribe to support the channel. The sky above Vigilant Spire cracked open, revealing a bleeding wound of reality. It was not the localized tear of a warp jump, but a chronological hemorrhage, a violent shudder in the fabric of space-time that sent tremors through the Hive city's foundations. High above the smog-choked spires, the rift pulsed with a sickly bruised light, casting long, distorted shadows across the Gothic architecture of the Forge Fane of the Nine. Inside the sanctum, the air grew heavy, thick, with the scent of ionized ozone and the metallic tang of ancient recycled air. Magos Row 9 stood motionless, his mechanical dendrites twitching in a frantic dance of data acquisition. His optical sensors, multiple glowing lenses of varying sizes, whirred as they focused on the central dais. There lay the Chrono sarcophagus, an artifact of forbidden provenance, its surface etched with glyphs that seemed to shift and writhe whenever one looked away. The machine hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration that resonated in the chests of the tech thralls kneeling in the shadows. A servo skull drifted through the haze, its red ocular beam scanning the frost-covered glass of the stasis pod. Within the distorted reflection of the lens, a silhouette began to move. It was a shape that had been absent from the universe for millennia, a thought artifact preserved against the entropy of time. The Magos adjusted his Vox grill, a series of clicks and static bursts preceding his mechanical monotone. The checksum is verified, he droned. The anchor holds. Initiate the breath of life. The silence of the tomb was shattered by the scream of 1,000 sirens. Outside the sanctum, the Hive city groaned as its industrial heart labored to stabilize the energy surge. But within the chamber, a smaller sound dominated the chaos. From the pocket of the man inside the pod, a sound emerged that should have been impossible, the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a gold pocket watch. Tick, tick, tick. The watch beat backward 3 times, 3 sharp clicks that seemed to halt the very flow of the surrounding energy. At the 3rd beat, the sirens outside shifted frequency, transitioning from a frantic wail to a low, mournful dirge. The frost on the glass shattered into 1,000,000 crystalline shards, and the lid of the sarcophagus hissed open, venting a cloud of cryogenic vapor that obscured the floor. A hand pale and trembling, but possessed of an undeniable authority, gripped the edge of the pod. The fingers were short, the nails clean, a stark contrast to the grime and augmented filth of the 41st millennium. Napoleon Bonaparte pulled himself upward, his lungs burning as they tasted the toxic processed oxygen of the spire. He did not scream. He did not panic. He simply breathed, his eyes cold, sharp, and brimming with a terrifying intellect, darting across the room to take in the impossible nightmare of his new reality. The Magos stepped forward, his heavy robes scraping against the cold floor. Behind him stood Inquisitor Vahl, her power armor painted in the obsidian and gold of her office, her hand resting habitually on the hilt of her power sword. She watched the man from the past with a mixture of clinical curiosity and deep-seated dread. To her, he was a potential saint or a catastrophic heresy, a variable that the Imperium could neither control nor predict. "Where is the sun?" Napoleon's voice was a rasp, a dry echo of a language that had evolved into 1,000 different dialects since his death. Yet through the linguistic filters of the Magos's vox array, the authority in his tone remained intact. He did not ask who they were. He did not ask where he was. He asked for the sun, the fundamental logic of a battlefield he no longer recognized. Magos Row 9 tilted his head, the logic engines in his cranium processing the query. The sun of your origin is 40,000 light-years distant. Subject prime, the machine priest replied. Here there is only the spire. There is only the Emperor's light. And there is only war. Napoleon looked at the mechanical monstrosity before him, then at the towering Inquisitor, and finally at the flickering holographic displays showing millions of casualties across a sector he had no name for. He reached into his vest, pulling out the gold watch. It had stopped. The realization hit him not as a shock, but as a cold calculation. The scale of the room, the terrifying height of the ceilings, the way the light seemed to be swallowed by the shadows, it was a landscape of the sublime and the horrific. He saw the servo skulls bobbing in the air, like carrion birds, their human origins visible in the bleached bone and trailing wires. He saw the tech thralls, their limbs replaced by pistons, their faces erased by masks of rusted iron. This is not a kingdom, Napoleon whispered, his gaze fixing on the Inquisitor. This is a tomb that refuses to close. Vahl stepped into the light, her face a mask of scarred discipline. It is the Imperium of Man General, she corrected, her voice like grinding stones. And you have been summoned because we have forgotten how to win. We have only learned how to endure. Napoleon stood fully now, ruffling the front of his archaic uniform. The cloth was preserved, yet it felt fragile against the oppressive atmosphere of the hive. He looked at the morale map flickering on a nearby terminal, a sea of red icons representing crumbling fronts and shattered regiments. His mind, a masterpiece of strategic geometry, began to trace the lines of supply and the vectors of fear. He saw the flaws. He saw the waste. In this Gothic nightmare, he saw a canvas of chaos that demanded the hand of a master. You speak of endurance as if it were a virtue. Napoleon said, his voice gaining strength, echoing off the high-arched vaults of the Forge Fane. Endurance is the philosophy of the defeated. I do not recognize this emperor you worship, but I recognize the stench of a failing campaign. He walked toward the holographic map, his boots clicking on the metal floor, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the dormant watch in his hand. The tech thralls recoiled as he approached their primitive programming, sensing an aura of command that bypassed their neural inhibitors. They saw not a man, but a Kovatu, a living artifact of thought. Even Row 9 stepped back, his processors struggling to categorize the sheer density of the man's presence. It was a weight that did not come from physical size, but from the absolute certainty of his own genius. Napoleon pointed a finger at the vigilant spire's logistical heart on the display. Your soldiers die because you treat them as fuel, not as fire, he stated, his eyes reflecting the red glow of the war map. You have built a cathedral to failure. Tell me, Magos, how many men have you lost today? Row 9's lenses whirred. 17,000 in the lower sectors. An acceptable margin of attrition. Napoleon's lip curled in a sneer that was both ancient and devastating. There is no such thing as an acceptable margin of incompetence. Outside, the sirens reached a fever pitch, a jagged scream that signaled the first breach of the outer hive walls. The ground shook as macro cannons roared in the distance, a sound like the gods themselves were slamming doors in the dark. The ozonated air in the sanctum vibrated with the impact, and for a moment, The holographic map flickered, showing a new threat and the vanguard of Akhrazor, the Chaos Champion, carving a path of blood toward the Spire's heart. Napoleon did not flinch at the tremor. He merely adjusted the collar of his coat, his mind already beginning to dismantle the tactical nightmare before him. He was a man out of time, a ghost in a machine of infinite slaughter. But as he looked at the terrified eyes of the human servants in the room, a familiar spark ignited in his soul. He was Napoleon, and if this was hell, then he would simply have to conquer it. "The clock has stopped," he said softly, looking at the silent watch in his palm. "But the sun has not yet set on my ambition. Show me your ledgers, Magos. Show me your maps of fear. If I am to be your shadow, then I shall be the one that eclipses your enemies." In that moment, the first chapter of his new empire began, written in the soot and blood of a world that had forgotten the name of France, but would soon remember the weight of a crown. The air in the vigilant spire was not air. It was a recycled soup of industrial lubricants, stale incense, and the salt of 1 billion unwashed bodies. Napoleon walked through the corridors of the upper hive, his hand resting on the hilt of a ceremonial saber that Row 9 had restored for him from the forge vaults. Every step was a lesson in the grotesque. The walls were not made of stone or plaster, but of reinforced plasteel layered with the devotional scripts of the ecclesiarchy and the calcified grime of 10,000 years. Servitors' limbless, brain-scrubbed husks floated past him on anti-grav units carrying data slates with the mindless efficiency of clockwork dolls. He felt the weight of the city above and below him, a vertical continent of iron and sorrow that seemed to groan under the sheer pressure of its own existence. The sensory overload was a physical assault. The low-frequency hum of the hive's atmospheric scrubbers vibrated in his teeth, while the flickering glow of red emergency lumens painted the shadows with the color of fresh blood. Napoleon's mind, a machine of perfect order and Enlightenment logic, struggled to reconcile the scale of this place. In his era, a city was a collection of streets and squares, a thing that could be charted on a single piece of parchment. Vigilant Spire was a mountain of Gothic madness, its peaks lost in the toxic clouds of the stratosphere, its roots buried in the lightless depths of the sub-hive, where things without names prowled the ruins. He was no longer a conqueror of nations. He was an ant crawling across the face of a dying god. They entered the strategium, the nerve center of the Spire's defense. It was a cavernous hall where the flickering light of 1,000 green-tinted monitors cast a sickly pallor over the faces of the officers and tactical serfs. These were not the vibrant gold-braided marshals of his memory men, who smelled of gunpowder and horseflesh. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed creatures whose uniforms were stained with the soot of a dozen lost subsectors, and whose skin was grafted with shivering mechanical interfaces. At the center of the hall, a massive hololith projected a 3-dimensional map of the hive. It looked like a rotting tooth, its roots deep in the toxic crust of the planet, its crown jagged and broken by the bombardment of the Chaos Fleet. Logistics, Napoleon demanded his voice, cutting through the discordant hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of the cogitators. He stood before the hololith, his small stature reclaimed by the sheer intensity of his gaze. "I want the ledgers of your losses, the flow of your munitions, and something your machines have forgotten to calculate, the morale map. I need to see the matrix of fear." Inquisitor Vahl watched him from the shadows, her arms crossed over her breastplate. She motioned to Row 9, who glided forward, his metallic dendrites plugging into the console with a series of wet, mechanical squelches. Magos Row 9's multiple optical lenses whirred as they focused on the data streams. Fear is a chemical variance. Its subject prime, the machine priest, droned his voice, a flat, synthesized rasp. It is accounted for in the combat stimulant distribution and the periodic execution of those who falter in their litanies. To map it is to waste processing cycles on the irrational. Napoleon slammed his palm onto the cold metal of the console, a sound that made the nearby scribes flinch and the servo skulls bob in alarm. The echo of the blow seemed to ring through the entire strategium, silencing the murmurs of the tactical staff. Fear is not a chemical-mechanical ghost. Napoleon roared, his French accent thick with a fury that transcended time. Fear is the terrain upon which every battle is truly fought. It is the marsh that slows an advance. It is the precipice that turns a retreat into a slaughter. If you do not understand where your men are afraid, you do not understand where your lines will break. Show me the Vox chant contagion levels. Show me which sectors are silent and which are screaming. With a series of reluctant binary clicks, Row 9 obeyed. The green light of the hololith shifted, bleeding into a bruised, pulsing violet. This was the morale map, a visual representation of the Spire's collective psyche, showing where the shadow of Akhrazor was longest. Napoleon stared at the data, and for a moment the genius of the great captain faltered. In his time, the loss of 10,000 men at Borodino was a tragedy that redefined the limits of human endurance. Here, 10,000 was a rounding error, a footnote in a report that no one would ever read. He saw sectors where entire populations, millions of souls had been expended just to delay the chaos vanguard by mere minutes. The scale of the nothingness, the void of the 41st millennium, threatened to drown his intellect. He had spent his life fighting for glory, for a place in history. But here, history was a furnace that consumed everything and left only ash. The morale map revealed a terrifying truth. The Vox chant contagion, the psychic whispers of the warp, was spreading through the lower levels like a viral infection. It wasn't just fear. It was a fundamental erosion of reality. Men were not just afraid of dying. They were afraid that their deaths meant nothing. Napoleon looked at the red icons representing Akhrazor's forces. They weren't just soldiers. They were personifications of this nihilism. He felt the fracture of his humanity, the fracture of his own humanity. His genius, once a sun that blinded the kings of Europe, felt like a single candle flickering in a hurricane of infinite darkness. To these people, he was not a savior. He was just another ghost in a city full of them. Seeking a moment of clarity away from the suffocating logic of the Magos, Napoleon walked to a high balcony overlooking a refugee transit camp in the Spire's mid-levels. Thousands of people were huddled in the shadows of the massive macro cannons, their faces hidden behind masks of rusted iron and scraps of prayer parchment. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and unwashed despair. A small child, no more than 6 years old, sat on a pile of discarded shell casings, her eyes fixed on the atmospheric shields above. The sky was a churning sea of fire and debris where the Imperial Navy fought a losing battle against the Chaos cruisers. "Will the sky ever stop burning?" the child asked, her voice small and brittle, yet it carried further than the roar of the cannons. She looked at Napoleon, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of dying ships. Napoleon looked down at her, his throat tightening in a way it hadn't since the retreat from Moscow. He reached into his vest, his fingers brushing the cold gold of his stopped pocket watch. For the first time in 2 lives, the man who had mastered the art of the bulletin had no lie to offer. He had no grand promise of victory, no stirring speech about the eagles of France. He stood in silence, the emperor of the French, dwarfed by the agony of a child he could not protect in a universe that did not care. In that silence, a voiceover seemed to echo from the very walls of the spire, a cold realization that bypassed the ears and settled in the marrow of the bone. Here, genius is but a name thinner than paper before the void. Napoleon realized then that his enemy was not just a warlord named Akhrazor. It was the entropy of the human spirit. The Hive was a machine built to turn humans into fuel, and he had been summoned to be its most efficient stoker. His brilliance was being measured not by how many he could save, but by how effectively he could spend their lives. He turned away from the child and the burning sky, his shadow stretching long and thin across the metal floor of the balcony. His eyes were no longer those of the dreamer who saw united Europe. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and realized it was looking back. He walked back into the Strategium. His pace measured his resolve, hardening into something as cold and unforgiving as the plasteel walls. If the universe demanded a monster of logic to survive, he would provide one. He would take this map of hell and use it to draw a line that even the gods of chaos would fear to cross. Close the pressure valves in Sector 4, Napoleon commanded, as he stepped back to the hololith, his voice devoid of heat. Inquisitor Vahl looked up, her brow furrowing. There are 3 active regiments and 2 million civilians in that sector, General. If we close the valves, the atmospheric scrubbers will fail. They will suffocate in hours. Napoleon did not look at her. He pointed to the violet stain of the morale map where the Vox chant was strongest. They are already lost to the contagion. If we let them live, they become a bridge for the enemy. If we kill them now, we create a vacuum that Akhrazor must cross. The people there are already dead, Inquisitor. They just haven't stopped breathing yet. Now show me the munitions ledgers. I have a city to save, and I will not do it with mercy. The silence that followed the order to seal Sector 4 was not the silence of peace, but the suffocating hush of a mass grave. In the Strategium, the only sound was the rhythmic, wet clicking of Magos Row 9's data looms as they processed the finality of 2 million deaths. Napoleon stood before the hololith, his shadow cast long and jagged against the flickering violet glow of the morale map. He did not look at Inquisitor Vahl, nor did he acknowledge the trembling officers who now viewed him with a mixture of religious awe and primal terror. He was no longer just an artifact of the past. He was a surgeon who had just amputated a limb to save a dying body, and his hands were metaphorically stained with a cold, logical blood. Suddenly, the Vox grills throughout the hall erupted in a discordant shriek. It was a sound that defied the laws of acoustics, a grinding roar of metal on bone, layered with the wet, rhythmic chanting of 1,000 voices, screaming in a language that made the cogitators spark and smoke. The hololith flared the steady green and violet lines, twisting into a chaotic, pulsating red. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees, the ionized ozone replaced by the thick copper scent of a slaughterhouse. A projection began to form, not from the lenses of the emitters, but seemingly from the very shadows of the room. The image that coalesced was a nightmare of iron and gore. Akhrazor, the champion of the blood god, did not appear as a mere beast, but as a sovereign of slaughter. His armor was a Baroque masterpiece of brass and dried arterial spray fused to his mutated flesh with glowing rivets. He did not speak through a Vox array. His voice resonated within the skulls of everyone present, a sound like a mountain being crushed by a glacier. He stood amidst a field of skulls that stretched into the infinite distance of the warp, his chain axe resting on his shoulder like a scepter of ruin. The demon warrior's eyes, pits of smoldering coal, fixed upon the small man in the archaic blue uniform. There was no mockery in his gaze, only a terrifying predatory respect. He spoke, and the very glass of the monitors cracked under the weight of his words. "I have watched your work, little ghost," the monster rumbled the sound, vibrating in Napoleon's marrow. "You trade souls for time with the precision of a jeweler. You do not hide behind the shields of your false god. Nor do we feel the cowardice of trickery in your movements. You fight with the cold truth of the blade. For this I offer you a mercy that this rotting empire would never conceive." Akhrazor leaned forward, his massive silhouette blotting out the tactical displays of the Hive. "I wish to take this city intact." The champion declared, his voice a low growl that caused the tech thralls to collapse, in seizures of religious ecstasy or pure terror. "I wish to offer it to Khorne, not as a heap of ash, but as a monument of conquered will. I challenge you, General, to a duel of honor. Bring your logic, bring your discipline, and meet my vanguard at the Mirror Plaza. If you win, I shall withdraw my fleet for one solar cycle. If you fall, I shall claim your soul as my prize, and the spire shall burn with the purity of 1,000 suns." Then came the psychological blow, delivered with a cruelty that only an immortal being could craft. Akhrazor let out a sound that might have been a laugh, though it sounded more like a landslide. "You were an emperor once, were you not? You sat on a throne of gold and watched the world tremble. But look at you now, a flea dancing on the hide of a dying titan. Here in this era of shadows, there is only one emperor, a corpse god, who cannot hear your prayers. You are nothing but a flicker of light before the eternal dark. Why die for a master who has already forgotten you?" Napoleon did not flinch. He did not look to Vahl for guidance, nor did he check the sensors of the Magos. He stepped forward, entering the flickering red light of the projection, until he stood face to face with the towering image of the Chaos Champion. He looked remarkably small, a figure of lace and wool standing against a god of iron. Yet his posture was that of a man who had stared down the sun at Austerlitz. He reached into his vest and pulled out his gold pocket watch, the metal cold and silent in his palm. "You speak of honor as if it were a currency creature." Napoleon said, his voice quiet, but carrying the absolute weight of a sovereign. "But you are a slave to your hunger, just as these machines are slaves to their logic. You want this city intact because you are afraid of the void. You fear that if you destroy everything, there will be nothing left to define your strength. You call me a ghost, but I am the only thing in this room that is truly alive, for I am the only one who still knows the value of a single well-placed death." He clicked the casing of the watch, shut the sound sharp and final. "I accept your invitation. Not for honor, and certainly not for your mercy. I accept it because you have made the mistake of thinking my genius is a tool of the Imperium. It is not. It is my own." The projection shattered into 1,000 shards of red light, leaving the strategium in a state of stunned, airless silence. Inquisitor Vahl stepped out of the darkness, her hand gripping the hilt of her power sword so tightly that the leather of her glove creaked. Her eyes were fixed on Napoleon, not with admiration, but with a growing cold suspicion. She had seen saints and she had seen traitors, but she had never seen a man who could talk to a champion of Khorne with such terrifying parity. "You are playing a dangerous game." General Vahl whispered, her voice like the edge of a razor. "Akhrazor does not know the meaning of a fair fight. He will bring the warp with him to that plaza. He will tear the logic from your mind before he tears the heart from your chest. Napoleon turned to her, his expression unreadable, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the hololith. Logic is not a shield, Inquisitor. It is a trap. He thinks he's inviting me to a duel. He thinks he is using me to prove his superiority to his dark gods. Napoleon walked back to the command console, his mind already spinning a web of tactical variables that Vahl could not begin to comprehend. He called me an emperor. Napoleon said softly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that looked more like a scar. And he was right. An emperor does not save his people. He uses them to build his monument. You summoned me because you wanted a savior. But you have brought a man who knows that the most effective way to win a war is to become the very thing the enemy fears most. The reversal was now clear to Row 9 and Vahl, though they dared not speak it aloud. Napoleon was not going to the Mirror Plaza to save the Vigilant Spire. He was going there to use the city, its people, and even the Inquisitor herself as bait. He was setting a trap not just for Akhrazor, but for the very system that had resurrected him. He was a thought artifact that had realized its own power, and in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, a man with a plan was more dangerous than a god with a sword. The first move of the duel had already been made, and the board was soaked in the blood of Sector 4. The Vox chant contagion was not a sound one heard with the ears, but a vibration that rotted the soul. In the lower industrial hubs of the Vigilant Spire, the air was thick with a rhythmic, distorted pulsing, a psychic echo of Akhrazor's presence that turned prayers into screams and hope into a corrosive madness. Men who had spent 80 years turning the same bolt on a macro cannon suddenly began to weep tears of oil, their voices joining a cacophony that bypassed the Hive's vox thumpers. The ecclesiarchy's priests had tried to drown it out with holy hymns, but their incense was powerless against the stench of reality breaking apart. Chaos was not invading with soldiers yet. It was invading through the cracks in the human spirit. Napoleon Bonaparte stood in the center of the Subsector 9 administration hub, a place of rusted iron and flickering lumens that smelled of ancient sweat and the metallic tang of recycled water. He was no longer the pristine figure who had emerged from the stasis pod. His blue uniform was stained with the soot of the lower levels, and a fine layer of industrial grime coated his skin. He watched as a group of frantic laborers threw themselves at the feet of a stone gargoyle, their fingers bleeding as they clawed at the cold rock, begging for a salvation that would never come. He did not look at them with pity. He looked at them as a master looks at a failing machine. The contagion spreads because you allow them the luxury of grief. Napoleon set his voice flat and cold, cutting through the weeping like a guillotine blade. Beside him, Inquisitor Vahl watched her hand hovering near her bolter. She had expected him to offer words of inspiration, the legendary charisma of the little corporal. Instead, she saw a man who had realized that in this universe, inspiration was a resource they could no longer afford. Napoleon pointed to the massive pressure doors that sealed Subsector 9 from the primary oxygen processing plants. Magos Napoleon commanded, not turning to look at Row 9. Calculate the spread of the chant if we maintain the current ventilation cycles. The machine priest's vox emitter crackled. The frequency will reach critical resonance in 84 minutes. Total cognitive collapse of the mid-hive is projected within the next shift. Napoleon nodded a sharp bird-like movement. Then we seal it. Not just the doors, but the life support. We purge the air and replace it with industrial suppressant. We turn this sector into a tomb of silence. Vahl stepped forward, her shadow looming over the general. There are 400,000 workers in Subsector 9 who have not yet turned general. You are asking me to execute the Emperor's loyal servants by the thousands." Napoleon turned to her, his eyes two chips of frozen flint. "They are no longer servants, Inquisitor. They are conduits for a psychic plague. Every breath they take feeds the monster at our gates. If you wish to save the city, you must stop treating these people as lives and start treating them as a fire break. You burn the forest to save the palace. Do not lecture me on the cost of victory. I have buried more men than you have ever commanded." The order was given. With a series of thunderous mechanical groans, the heavy blast doors began to slide shut, sealing thousands of screaming souls into the darkness. Napoleon did not look away. He stood by the control console listening to the muffled thuds of fists against metal, a sound that slowly faded as the oxygen was bled from the rooms. He reached for a flask of recycled water, the liquid lukewarm and tasting of rust and chemicals. He drank it without flinching. The fracture of his humanity was widening. He was becoming dirty, absorbing the cruelty of the 41st millennium into his very bones. To ensure the iron discipline held Napoleon, ordered the remaining PDF units to don rust masks, crude iron facial plates that suppressed individual expression and muffled the Vox chant. He walked among the ranks of these masked soldiers, his presence a dark gravitational force. He did not give them a speech about glory. He gave them a protocol for survival. "You are no longer men," he told them, his voice echoing through the metallic filters of their masks. "You are the walls of the city. A wall does not feel fear. A wall does not hear the wind. You will stand until you are stone, or you will be replaced by it." The atmosphere in the spire shifted. The frantic religious hysteria was replaced by a heavy, leaden silence. The silence of the state of the machine, of the Emperor's shadow. Napoleon was no longer just a guest of the Inquisition. He was the architect of a new terrifying order. He was using the very tools of the Imperium, its disregard for the individual, its brutal efficiency, and refining them with the tactical brilliance of a man who knew how to manage fear as if it were a ledger of grain. He was creating a Bauchua Canthiet, a necessary tyrant, and Inquisitor Vahl began to realize that the man they had resurrected might be more dangerous to the Imperium than the demon he was meant to fight. As the last of the screams died out in Subsector 9, the morale map on Napoleon's portable data slate flickered from a frantic pulsing violet back to a dull, stagnant gray. The Vox chant had been broken, silenced by the sheer weight of a collective grave. Napoleon reached into his vest and pulled out the gold watch. It remained silent, but for a fleeting second, he thought he felt the internal gears twitch, as if the cold logic of his actions had provided a spark of power to the dead artifact. "The enemy will arrive soon," Napoleon whispered to the darkness of the administrative hub. "And when he does, he will find a city that has forgotten how to scream. He will find a city that is as cold and empty as the heart of a god." He looked down at his hands, now stained with the grime of 1,000 deaths, and for the first time, the legendary general felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in centuries. Not regret, but a deep, hollow exhaustion. He was winning. But in the grim darkness of the far future, winning felt exactly like losing. The Strategium had become a tomb of cold calculations, lit only by the flickering phosphor glow of ancient monitors and the rhythmic pulsing of stasis field generators. Napoleon Bonaparte sat at the head of a massive obsidian table, his small frame silhouetted against a hololithic display of the Hive's cascading resource grids. He was no longer a man out of time. He was the ghost in the machine, the architect of a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Opposite him stood Inquisitor Vahl, her armor reflecting the dim light like a predator's scales, her hand never far from the hilt of her power sword. Between them, Magos Row 9 hovered a multi-limbed weaver of data, whose optical sensors whirred with the frantic processing of 1 billion life signs. The tension in the room was a palpable, jagged thing. Napoleon's decision to seal Sector 4 and Subsector 9 had stabilized the Vox chant levels, but at a cost that even the Inquisition found harrowing. Vahl's gaze was fixed on the general, her eyes filled with a simmering, righteous fury. She had spent her life purging the weak to protect the soul of the Imperium. But Napoleon was doing something different. He wasn't purging them for the sake of purity. He was liquidating them for the sake of efficiency. To the Inquisitor, this was a dangerous pragmatism that bordered on the ultimate heresy, the belief that human lives were merely fuel for a tactical fire. You are treating the Emperor's subjects as if they were nothing more than lead and powder. General Vahl's voice was a low, dangerous snarl that echoed through the vaulted chamber. My duty is to ensure the survival of the human spirit. Your discipline is a slow-acting poison. You have silenced the screams of the dying, only to replace them with the silence of the machine. The people of this spire are not just resources to be spent on a map. She stepped closer, her shadow engulfing the general. If we lose our humanity to save the city, then the city is already lost. I have authorized exterminatus for less than the crimes you commit in the name of logic. Napoleon looked up, his expression as unyielding as the plasteel walls of the Hive. He did not blink. He did not show fear. He merely adjusted the gold watch on the table, its casing reflecting the cold light of the monitors. Humanity is a luxury of the victorious Inquisitor, he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. You speak of the spirit, while the body of your empire is rotting from within. I do not see subjects. I see biomass. I see kinetic potential. I see millions of hands that can either hold a rifle or feed a demon. If I kill them, I deny the enemy his strength. If I use them, I create a shield. You would rather kill them for their purity. I choose to use them for their utility. Tell me which of us is the true monster. Magos Row 9 intervened his Vox array, emitting a series of high-pitched binary bursts before settling into a monotone translation. Statistical analysis indicates a 78% increase in defensive efficiency since the implementation of the Bonaparte Protocol, the Machine Priest stated. The Rust Mask Initiative has successfully suppressed individual neural deviance by 92%. However, the long-term cognitive stability of the remaining population is declining. They are becoming hollow. Their devotion to the Golden Throne is being supplanted by an instinctive obedience to the Shadow's commands. Row 9's lenses whirred as they focused on Napoleon. General, you are optimizing the system, but you are deleting the soul of the operating environment. Napoleon stood walking to the edge of the hololith. He pointed to the massive lower Hive slums where the Rust Mask regiments were being organized. A soul cannot hold a breach, Magos. A soul cannot stop a chain axe. You summoned me because your faith was failing to provide results. I am providing you with the only thing that matters in a war of annihilation order. You call me a tyrant. I accept the title. But I am a tyrant who understands that a man who has nothing left to lose is the perfect soldier. I have given these people a purpose to be the grit in the gears of the enemy's advance. Vahl's hand tightened on her sword. She saw the truth now, and it terrified her more than the chaos champion at the gates. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he was a mirror. He was reflecting the cold, brutal core of the Imperium, back at her stripped of the comforting lies of religion and ritual. He was a necessary tyrant, a creature of pure, undiluted will that the system had called forth to save itself, only to find that it could not control the beast it had unleashed. The triangle of tension was complete. Vahl fought for a soul that was already dying. Row 9 fought for a logic that was incomplete. And Napoleon fought for a victory that required the total erasure of the individual. "The people are beginning to worship you," Bonaparte Vahl whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of dread and realization. "In the darkness of the lower levels, they don't pray to the emperor anymore. They pray to the man in the blue coat who silenced the voices in their heads. They wear your rust masks as icons of a new faith. I see what you are doing. You aren't just defending the spire. You are building your own empire within its walls. You are treading on the very edge of godhood, and you know what happens to those who challenge the emperor's light." Napoleon turned to her, a faint chilling smile touching his lips. It was the smile of a man who had already seen his own Waterloo and was no longer afraid of the fall. "I do not seek worship, Inquisitor. I seek results. If they wish to believe in me, let them. If it makes them stand longer against the dark, then it is another resource I can use. You fear my influence, but you are afraid to kill me because without me, Akhrazor will turn this spire into a slaughterhouse within the hour. You need my heresy to survive your faith." He turned back to the map, his eyes tracing the path toward the Mirror Plaza. "The duel is approaching. Prepare your finest warriors, not to fight but to watch. I want them to see what happens when a mind of steel meets a heart of fire." As the Inquisitor stormed out of the chamber, her cape snapping like a whip, Napoleon remained in the silence with the Magos. The air was thick with the scent of ozonated tension. He looked at the gold watch again. It was still silent, but the cold weight of it felt like a promise. He had successfully managed the fear of the people, but he knew he was walking a razor's edge. The Bao Chua Ken Thiet had been born, and the vigilant spire was now his instrument. But in the grim darkness of the far future, even an instrument as grand as a hive city could be broken in a single well-placed stroke of fate. The duel was no longer just about survival. It was about the definition of humanity itself. The Mirror Plaza was not a square of glass, but a massive amphitheater of polished obsidian and psychically tuned silver, located at the precise geometric center of the vigilant spire. Here, the machine spirit of reflection resided, a vast, ancient cogitator array that processed the Hive's visual data into a singular, cohesive stream of surveillance. The walls were lined with thousands of reflective panels, each flickering with the ghostly images of a billion lives being lived, suffered, and lost in the levels below. Napoleon stood in the center of this hall of echoes, his silhouette multiplied 1,000 times in the dark glass. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at himself, his image distorted by the flickering power surges of the spire's dying heart. Beside him, Magos Row 9 was a flurry of mechanical activity. The priest's dendrites were plugged into the plaza's primary nerve conduits, his binary chants harmonizing with the low hum of the machine spirit. They were setting the trap of definitions. Napoleon had realized that the Chaos Champion Akhrazor was bound by the very laws of his dark faith. To Akhrazor, victory was blood. Honor was a direct, brutal confrontation. By choosing this plaza, Napoleon was not just choosing a battlefield. He was choosing a logic gate. He was preparing to redefine the terms of the engagement, turning the demon's own sense of honor into a cage of silver and light. The machine spirit is Resistant Row 9's voice crackled through the Vox array, sounding more strained than usual. It senses the temporal anomaly of your present subject prime. It struggles to reconcile your historical truth with the current reality of the 41st millennium. You are a variable that the logic gate cannot categorize. Napoleon stepped toward the central console, his hand brushing the cold, smooth surface of an obsidian pillar. "Then tell it I am a ghost of its own making," he whispered. "Tell it that I am the reflection of every soldier who ever dreamed of home, and every king who ever feared the dark. I am the definition of the human will stripped of your rituals." As Napoleon spoke, the 1,000 mirrors in the plaza began to shimmer with a new cold light. The images of the Hive's suffering faded, replaced by a singular blinding reflection of the general himself. But it was not the Napoleon of the present. The mirrors showed him at the bridge of Arcole, at the sun-drenched fields of Austerlitz, and amidst the freezing horrors of the retreat from Moscow. The machine's spirit was devouring his memory, turning his past into a tactical weapon. The air in the plaza grew thin, the pressure of the past weighing down on the present, until the very floor seemed to vibrate with the ghostly sound of marching boots and rolling drums. Suddenly, the gold pocket watch in Napoleon's vest gave a sharp, violent jerk. It didn't just tick, it shrieked. For the first time since his resurrection, the internal gears groaned into motion, moving backward one full beat. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent plaza. Napoleon gasped, clutching his chest, as a wave of temporal vertigo washed over him. The world around him blurred, the silver walls, the mechanical priest, the flickering lumens. All of it felt like a dream that was starting to dissolve. Magos Row 9 froze his multiple eyes, whirring in a frantic, terrifying synchronicity. He turned his head toward Napoleon, his Vox grill emitting a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. "General." "The checksum has failed," the machine. Priest droned, his voice filled with a static-drenched dread. "The chronal anchor is slipping. Time itself is refusing to hold you. You are becoming a null event, a piece of history that the universe is trying to erase to save its own consistency." The watch had stopped again, but the damage was done. Napoleon was no longer a solid part of this world. He was a glitch in the tapestry of the Emperor's reality. This was the midpoint twist, the realization that his existence was not a gift of the Inquisition, but a cosmic error that was being corrected. Inquisitor Vahl stepped into the plaza, her power sword drawn, its blue field illuminating the fear in her eyes. She had heard the watch. She saw the way Napoleon's form seemed to flicker at the edges, like a hololith losing power. "The system is reacting to you, Bonaparte," she said, her voice a low, dangerous warning. "The more you exert your will, the more the Imperium's logic tries to delete you. You are creating a paradox that could tear this spire apart before the demon even reaches the gates." Napoleon straightened his coat, his face a mask of grim determination despite the trembling in his limbs. He looked at Vahl, then at the 1,000 reflections of his own fading glory. "Then, let it delete me," he said, his voice regaining its command. "But it will only do so after I have finished my work. If I am a glitch, I will be the one that crashes the enemy system." He turned back to the mirrors, his mind sharpening into a weapon of pure cold focus. He realized now the truth of Reversal 2. His discipline hadn't saved the people. It had only created a necessary tyrant that the universe was now programmed to destroy. He was a tool that had become too sharp a savior who had become a threat. The trap was set, but it was no longer just for Akhrazor. Napoleon realized that he was standing in a double bind. To defeat the Chaos Champion, he had to use the full weight of his tactical genius, but to do so would accelerate his own erasure. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against a god of blood and another against the very fabric of time. The mirror Plaza hummed with the energy of 1,000 definitions, each one a different version of the man who had once conquered a world. "Prepare the flux cage," Napoleon commanded row 9, ignoring the flickering of his own hands. "If the universe wants to erase me, it will have to do so through the blood of my enemies. We will meet Akhrazor here in this hall of mirrors. We will show him that even a ghost can draw a line in the sand." As the light in the plaza dimmed and the first sounds of the demon's approach began to echo through the hive's vents, Napoleon felt a strange, terrifying peace. He was a man with no future and a fading past, but in the present he was still the emperor. And he would ensure that his final act was one that the galaxy would never be able to forget, even if it succeeded in deleting his name. The 9th day of the siege arrived not with a sunrise, but with a deepening of the perpetual twilight that choked the vigilant spire. Below the mirror plaza, the hive was a silent graveyard, its atmospheric scrubbers stilled by Napoleon's orders, leaving the air thick with a cold metallic frost. The only sound was the vox click of the thousands of rust-masked soldiers stationed in the shadows of the obsidian pillars, a rhythmic, inhuman ticking that mimicked the pulse of a machine. At the center of this geometric nightmare stood Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a small, solitary figure in a vast sea of silver and glass, his blue coat buttoned tight against a chill that came not from the weather, but from the thinning of reality itself. The mirror plaza hummed. The thousands of reflective panels that lined the walls were no longer showing the present. Instead, they were caught in a feedback loop of memory and data flickering with images of bayonets, muddy fields, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the Emperor's shadow. Napoleon stood perfectly still, his hand tucked into his vest, clutching the gold pocket watch. He could feel it vibrating against his palm, a frantic, irregular beat that felt like a dying bird. To his left, Magos Row 9 was a statue of bronze and cable, his sensors focused on the heavy blast doors at the far end of the plaza. To his right, Inquisitor Vahl stood with her power sword unsheathed, the blade's blue hum the only light in the oppressive gloom. Then the silence was shattered. The massive adamantium doors at the entrance of the plaza did not open. They were liquidated. A wave of heat and concentrated warp energy turned the metal into a puddle of molten slag that hissed as it hit the cold obsidian floor. From the glowing orange aperture stepped Akhrazor. The Chaos Champion was a titan of brass and dried blood, his presence so heavy it seemed to warp the very light around him. His chain axe, the reaper of logic, hungered for the kill its teeth, whirring with a sound like 1,000 saws grinding against bone. He did not roar. He walked with the slow, terrifying confidence of a predator who has already won. Akhrazor stopped 10 paces from Napoleon. He looked at the mirrors, seeing 10,000 versions of the general, and then at the general himself. The demon's vox array emitted a sound of pure, vibrating contempt. "You hide behind glass and ghosts," little strategist Akhrazor growled, his voice a physical force that made the mirrors rattle in their frames. "You have silenced your city to hear yourself think, but your thoughts are nothing but whispers in the storm. Honor demands a blade. Honor demands the truth of the kill. You offer me only reflections of a dead world. Is this the genius of the great Captain Amaze of Hyder's glass?" Napoleon did not move. He did not reach for his saber. He simply looked up at the towering monster, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the melted door. "Honor is the mask of the unimaginative, Akhrazor Napoleon," replied, his voice calm, amplified by the Plaza's acoustic focusing architecture until it sounded like a choir of one. "You think you seek a duel. You think you seek the glory of the kill. But you are a slave to the very definitions you claim to despise. You call me a hider, yet you are the one trapped in the logic of your hunger. You cannot see the battlefield because you are blinded by the blood on your own hands." The vox click of the soldiers grew louder, a steady hypnotic beat that seemed to synchronize with the flickering of the mirrors. Napoleon's reflections began to move independently of him. In one mirror, he was pointing a sword toward a distant horizon. In another, he was turning away from a burning bridge. The machine spirit of the Plaza was beginning to hemorrhage Napoleon's tactical subconscious, projecting his memories as physical barriers of light and shadow. Akhrazor swung his axe in a wide, violent arc, shattering a dozen mirrors, but the reflections only multiplied the shards of glass, showing Napoleon's cold, judging eyes from 1,000 different angles. "Tricks." Akhrazor roared, his patience snapping like a dry branch. "I will carve the reality from your bones." He charged a mountain of iron and hate, moving with impossible speed. But as he crossed the threshold of the central dais, the trap of definitions snapped shut. The mirrors didn't just reflect light, they reflected intent. Every time Akhrazor struck at a reflection, the kinetic energy of his blow was absorbed by the silvered surfaces and redirected. The air around the demon began to shimmer with the force of his own anger, turning his strength into a cage of redirected momentum. Napoleon watched him, his expression one of clinical observation. "In my world, the map is not the territory," the general said softly. "But in this place, the territory is whatever I define it to be. You came here seeking a warrior. You found a mathematician." The Inquisitor and the Magos watched in stunned silence. They saw the great captain not as a hero of the sword, but as a master of the nothingness, the void of meaning. He was using the demon's own honor, his own refusal to use trickery to bind him in a logic loop that the warp-tainted mind could not calculate. The atmosphere in the Plaza reached a breaking point. The sound of the vox click and the ticking watch merged into a single, deafening pulse, the heartbeat of the vigilant spire itself. The rust-masked soldiers stood like gargoyles, their iron faces reflecting the chaos of the duel. They were no longer afraid. They were part of the machine, the tools of a mind that had realized that in the 41st millennium, the only way to win was to be more cold, more calculated, and more terrifying than the demons of the warp. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of the storm, his shadow stretching across the obsidian floor like a dark crown, waiting for the moment when the demon's logic would finally break. The 9th day had become the moment of the great reversal. The legend was no longer just a memory. He was a living weapon, a necessary tyrant who had turned a hive city into an extension of his own will. But as Napoleon looked into the shattering mirrors, he saw something that made even his iron resolve flicker, the reflection of his own watch, its hands spinning wildly in a direction that did not exist. He was winning the battle, but he was losing his grip on existence itself. The duel was only beginning, and the price of victory was rising with every tick of the clock. The air in the Mirror Plaza screamed a discordant harmony of grinding metal and the high-pitched whine of overtaxed logic engines. Every time Akhrazor's chain axe, the Reaper of Logic, struck the obsidian floor or the silvered walls, the impact did not dissipate. It echoed, magnified by the machine spirit's redirection. The Chaos Champion roared a sound of raw, unadulterated fury that shattered several glass panels. But Napoleon remained untouched. The general stood with his hand tucked into his vest, his posture as calm as if he were reviewing a parade in the Tuileries. He began to speak, his voice a cold, precise scalpel that cut through the demon's cacophony. "You swore an oath." Akhrazor Napoleon's voice rang out, projected by the thousands of reflective shards, until it seemed to come from the very air itself. "You swore to your blood god that you would win this city without the trickery of the warp. You swore to prove that your strength alone was enough to conquer the vigilant spire. But look at you now. You strike at shadows. You bleed for nothing. Your own honor has become the very leash that keeps you from reaching me. You are not fighting a man. You are fighting the definition of your own failure." Akhrazor lunged his massive brass-bound boots, cracking the obsidian floor. "Honor is not a leash worm. It is the blood that feeds my god." He swung his axe in a vertical cleave that should have split the general in two. But as the blade descended, it met only a flickering reflection of Napoleon, a ghost of light and data. The real Napoleon was 3 paces to the left, his eyes fixed not on the demon, but on the flickering data lumens of the Plaza's ceiling. The dance of the words had begun a tactical deconstruction of the enemy's psyche. Honor is a definition creature. Napoleon countered, his tone instructional, almost bored. And definitions are the domain of the mind, not the blade. By swearing to fight fairly, you have accepted my rules of engagement. You have allowed me to define what fair is. In this plaza, fair is the weight of a thought against the mass of an axe. You call yourself a champion, but a champion is a role, a structure, a limitation. You are a slave to the rhythm of the battle I have written for you. You strike because I allow it. You miss because I have willed it. The demon paused, his chest heaving, the glowing rivets of his armor hissing as they cooled. For the first time, a flicker of something other than rage crossed his mutated features. Doubt. In the warp logic was a fluid, dying thing, easily ignored in favor of slaughter. But here, reinforced by the ancient cogitators of the Hive and the iron will of the strategist logic, was a prison. Akhrazor's very existence was rooted in the concept of being a champion of corn. If he could not strike his foe, he was no longer a warrior. If he was no longer a warrior, he was a failure in the eyes of his god. Your god demands blood. Napoleon continued, stepping closer to the demon, his small stature reclaimed by the absolute gravity of his presence. But he does not care whose blood it is. If you cannot spill mine, you will eventually spill your own in frustration. You are trapped in a syllogism, a Akhrazor. To kill me, you must use the warp, which breaks your oath. To keep your oath, you must kill me with a blade that cannot touch me. Either way, the champion dies today. Not by my hand, but by the weight of his own broken promises. Akhrazor let out a choked, gargling sound, a rejection of the strategist's reality. He threw his chain axe aside, the massive weapon clattering across the floor, and chose instead to use his bare mutated claws. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim a primal truth, a move born of pure instinct. But that was the final trap. By discarding his weapon, he had discarded the last symbol of his martial rank. Napoleon signaled Magos Row 9 with a sharp nod. The silver panels throughout the plaza rotated in unison, their surfaces now reflecting not the general, but the empty, hollow voids where the demon's pride had once lived. The Vujiu Kuan Hung Kon Chu had stripped the monster of its identity. As the mirrors focused their collective light onto the central dais, they didn't just project images. They projected the nothingness, the void of meaning. Akhrazor collapsed to his knees, his brass armor turning brittle and gray. He was no longer a personification of war. He was a predictable variable in a larger equation that had already been solved. Napoleon looked down at the shivering mass of meat and brass, his expression one of cold, victorious finality. The battle ended before it began. The general whispered, "You simply took too long to realize you were already a ghost." The sky above the mirror plaza did not merely darken. It bruised the very fabric of reality, weeping as it was stretched thin by the weight of 1,000 paradoxical memories. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood that had yet to be spilled. Napoleon Bonaparte stood amidst the shards of the shattered reflections, a small anchor of blue and gold in a sea of gray nihilism. He reached into his vest, not for a pistol or a blade, but for the gold pocket watch. It felt hot against his skin, a burning coal of temporal energy that pulsed in time with the Hive's dying core. He looked at Akhrazor, who was still reeling from the psychological deconstruction of the dance of the words. The demon was no longer a mountain of iron. He was a collapsing star, his brass armor weeping black oil. Magos, the alignment is complete. Napoleon whispered, his voice carrying an unnatural weight through the plaza's acoustic focus. The enemy is defined. His honor is his cage. Now give him the finality he craves. Beside him, row 9's mechanical frame surged with power. The machine priest's dendrites were buried deep into the obsidian floor, tapping directly into the spire's primary flux conduits. The thousands of reflective panels that hadn't been shattered began to glow with a sickly, iridescent light. This was the flux cage, a perimeter of concentrated logic fields designed to strip the warp from the material world. Akhrazor looked up, his pits of eyes narrowing as he sensed the trap snapping shut. He tried to roar, but the sound was caught in his throat, replaced by a wet mechanical rattle. The flux cage did not just bind his limbs, it bound his very essence. The air within the cage became a solid block of anti-reality, vibrating at a frequency that canceled out the demon's chaotic resonance. He was being refined, distilled into a singular point of vulnerability. "You coward." The monster hissed the words, bubbling through the black ichor, leaking from his vox grill. Napoleon stepped forward, his boots clicking with a terrifying rhythmic precision. He did not look like a soldier in that moment. He looked like an executioner who had just finished calculating the exact weight of the rope. "A coward hides behind walls," Akhrazor Napoleon said, his voice cold and devoid of heat. "A genius uses the walls to crush his enemies. You wanted a shot at the heart of the Imperium. I will give you a shot that reflects the heart of its most faithful servant." He raised a hand, signaling the tech thralls stationed at the high balconies of the plaza. From the darkness above a long, slender barrel emerged a long-lost rifle, modified by the Magos, with a focus lens carved from the same obsidian as the plaza floor. It was not a weapon of mass destruction. It was a needle designed to thread the eye of a needle. The shot of genius was not about firepower. It was about the convergence of variables. Napoleon had waited for the exact moment when the demon's armor was at its most brittle, when the flux cage was at its peak, and when the light of the mirrors was focused into a singular beam of absolute truth. "Fire," Napoleon commanded. There was no thunderous explosion, only a sharp, high-pitched crack that sounded like the breaking of a frozen sea. A beam of white-hot energy lanced through the air, traveling along the path defined by the reflections. It didn't just strike Akhrazor. It navigated him. The beam entered through a hairline fracture in his chest plate, bypassed the hardened muscles of his corrupted physiology, and struck the black, shriveled heart of the Chaos Champion. For a heartbeat, the plaza was silent, bathed in a light so pure it blinded the servo skulls. Akhrazor's end was not a glorious explosion, but a rapid, agonizing dissolution. His armor did not shatter. It simply turned to dust, falling away, to reveal the hollow gray shell of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a lie. The demon essence vanished, sucked back into the warp, as if it had never existed, leaving only a pile of ash on the obsidian floor. The threat to the vigilant spire had been neutralized. The great captain had won the duel using nothing but a pocket watch, a few shards of glass, and the cold geometry of a mind that refused to be intimidated by gods. But as the light faded, the reversal 3 began to take hold. Winning the duel did not bring the relief of victory. It triggered a darker mechanism. Inquisitor Vahl stepped forward, her power sword crackling with renewed intensity. The Vox chant was gone, but in its place was a silence that felt even more dangerous. "You have defeated the champion." Bonaparte Vahl said, her voice like grinding stone. "But in doing so, you have proven yourself too dangerous for this world. You have shown that a man can manipulate the laws of the Imperium and the warp alike with a single thought. That is a power the Golden Throne cannot permit to exist." The shot of genius had saved the city, but it had also signaled the end of its savior. The Hive's defense systems, now purged of the chaos infection, began to reset. But they weren't resetting to protect the people. They were resetting to eliminate the anomaly that had seized control. The rust-masked soldiers stood motionless, their iron faces reflecting the cold blue light of Vahl's blade. Napoleon looked at the Inquisitor, then at his own flickering hands. He realized now that his victory was his own death warrant. The Imperium's survival mechanism was not just about killing demons. It was about erasing anything that threatened its absolute mindless authority. "The shot has been fired," Napoleon said, his voice a whisper that echoed in the empty plaza. "The battle is won." "But the war is just beginning, isn't it?" He looked down at the pile of ash that was once Akhrazor. He had conquered the demon, but he was now standing in the crosshairs of a god who did not care for genius. The shadow of the Emperor was falling over him, and this time there would be no mirrors to deflect the light. The smoke from Akhrazor's dissolution hung in the air, like a funeral shroud, thick and bitter, with the scent of burnt ozone and ionized brass. In the mirror plaza, the silence was absolute, yet it felt heavier than the roar of the cannons. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of the obsidian dais, his small frame trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the duel began to recede, leaving only a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at his hands. They were no longer flickering, but they felt heavy, as if the weight of the city he had saved was now physically pressing down on his shoulders. He was the victor, the master of the logic gate. Yet there was no cheering, no fanfare. There was only the sound of the hive breathing a ragged, mechanical wheeze. Suddenly, movement stirred in the shadows of the lower galleries. It started with one, then a dozen, then hundreds. Figures began to emerge from the darkness behind the pillars. They were the survivors of the lower sectors, laborers, tech thralls, and soldiers who had survived the Napoleon Protocol. They were still wearing the iron rust masks, but something had changed. They did not kneel toward the Golden Throne, nor did they look at the Inquisitor. They crawled toward the dais, their metal-shod fingers scraping against the obsidian floor, their eyes fixed on the man in the blue coat with a terrifying, ecstatic fervor. They had seen the shadow defeat the demon, and in the void of their despair, they had found a new god. The Napoleon cult was a spontaneous, grotesque eruption of hope in a world that forbade it. One of the soldiers, his mask painted with a crude white N in the center of his forehead, reached the foot of the dais and collapsed weeping tears of oil and salt. The Savior, the Shadow. He whispered, his voice amplified by the Plaza's acoustics. Behind him, the others began a low, rhythmic chant, a sound that lacked the musicality of a hymn but possessed the crushing force of a landslide. They were not worshiping a man. They were worshiping the efficiency of their own survival. They were worshiping the cold, brilliant mind that had turned them into a wall of stone. Inquisitor Vahl watched the scene with a horror that was colder than any fear she had felt during the siege. She stepped forward, her power sword crackling as it sheared through the heavy air. Silence. She screamed, her voice a thunderclap that briefly halted the chanting. She turned to Napoleon, her face a mask of scarred righteous fury. Do you see what you have done? General, you have traded a demon of the warp for a demon of the spirit. They look at you, and they see a salvation that is not sanctioned. They see a crown where there is only a shroud. This is the ultimate heresy, the worship of the human will over the divine order. Napoleon looked down at the kneeling masses, his expression unreadable. He saw his own face reflected 1,000 times in the iron masks of the cultists. He saw the fracture of his humanity in their eyes, the same fracture that was tearing his own soul apart. He did not ask for this, yet he knew that his genius was a flame that naturally attracted the moths of the hopeless. They are alive. Inquisitor Napoleon said, his voice quiet, but carrying the authority of a sovereign. Is that not what you wanted? I gave them a reason to stand. I gave them a victory. You gave them a poison, Vahl hissed. She raised her hand, signaling the squads of stormtroopers who stood in the upper arches. The red ocular beams of their targeters lanced down through the dark, settling on the heads of the kneeling cultists. A victory that comes at the cost of the Emperor's monopoly on the soul is no victory at all. It is a contagion. If I let this Napoleon take root, the vigilant spire will fall to civil war before the month is out. I cannot allow the memory of your genius to become a weapon against the throne. The order was given with a cold mechanical flick of Vahl's fingers. The stormtroopers fired. In the mirror plaza, the sound of the long-lost fire was like the snapping of 1,000 glass rods. There were no screams. The rust-masked soldiers had been trained too well. They fell where they knelt, their bodies collapsing onto the obsidian floor with the dull, hollow clatter of metal on stone. The white N on their masks was smeared with blood, turning the symbol of their hope into a mark of their execution. Napoleon watched as the people who had stood by him, the people who had become the grit in the gears for his plan, were liquidated with the same clinical efficiency he had used on the enemy. The sound of the masks falling, a rhythmic metallic leng-keng, echoed through the hall, a mocking percussion that signaled the system's bite. The Imperium was eating its own children to preserve its purity. Napoleon stood motionless, his hand gripping the cold gold watch in his vest so tightly that the metal began to bite into his palm. He realized then that he was not the hero of this story. He was the catalyst for a tragedy that would be erased before the ink was even dry. He was a thought contagion, and the Inquisition was the cure. Vahl walked across the field of corpses, her boots splashing in the cooling blood, until she stood directly in front of Napoleon. She did not strike him. She looked at him with a pity that was more painful than a blade. I do not hate you, Bonaparte, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her duty. In another age, you might have been a saint. But in this age, you are a disaster. I fear not what you have done, but what people will do in your name. They will commit atrocities in the name of your logic. They will burn worlds in the name of your genius. I must kill the legend before it kills the Imperium. Napoleon looked into her eyes and saw the absolute terrifying sincerity of her belief. He realized that Vahl was right. He had become an icon, a symbol of a different kind of darkness, the darkness of a human mind that believed it could solve the universe. "I was an emperor," Napoleon said softly, his voice echoing in the empty plaza. "I know the cost of being a memory. I once feared being forgotten. Now I realize that being remembered wrongly is a much greater curse." He reached into his vest and pulled out the pocket watch. It was silent, its hands frozen at the moment of the final purge. The victory was complete, and it had left him with nothing but the blood of his followers and the shadow of a crown he could no longer wear. The Mirror Plaza was a charnel house of iron and silence. The bodies of the Napoleon cult, still clad in their rusted masks, lay like discarded clockwork parts across the obsidian floor. The blue light from Inquisitor Vahl's power sword flickered in the pooling blood, casting long, distorted shadows that reached toward the man in the center of the carnage. Napoleon Bonaparte stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the white N painted on a nearby fallen mask. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had finally understood the punchline of a cosmic joke. The victory over Akhrazor had not been his liberation. It had been the final piece of evidence needed to justify his execution. Inquisitor Vahl stepped over a fallen soldier, her armor clanking with the heavy, rhythmic sound of a death knell. She stopped a few paces away, the humming blade of her sword held at her side. Her eyes were not filled with hatred, but with a terrifying religious certainty. "You see now why you cannot remain," she said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate with the Hive's dying core. "The Imperium is a temple of stone. It survives because it does not change. You are a spark of fire, General. If I let you live, you will burn the temple down just to see the stars again. I cannot allow your genius to become a heresy that outlives your flesh." Napoleon looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in his expression, only a vast, hollow exhaustion. He reached into his vest and pulled out the gold pocket watch. The metal was cold now, the internal gears finally stilled by the weight of the paradox he had created. "I once feared being nameless," he whispered, his voice echoing through the empty plaza like the rustle of dry leaves. "I spent my life building monuments so that the world would never forget the name of Bonaparte. I thought the void was the enemy, but I was wrong. In this nightmare you call a galaxy, the void is a mercy." He turned the watch over in his hand, looking at the intricate engravings that had survived 400 centuries. To be remembered here is to be a ghost that haunts the living. You say they would commit atrocities in my name. You say they would turn my logic into a religion of blood. You are right, Inquisitor. They would remember the Emperor, but they would forget the man. They would turn my memory into a cage for their own souls. If I am to be a crown, I choose to be a crown of thorns that no one can wear. Then accept the judgment, Vahl commanded, her voice hardening. Accept the erasure. Walk back into the shadows of history so that the Imperium may endure. This is the only way to protect the humanity you claim to value. By becoming nothing, you preserve everything. She gestured toward the far end of the plaza, where Magos Row 9 stood by a secondary stasis chamber, its blue containment field flickering like a dying eye. The machine priest weighted his sensors, recording the final data points of the Bonaparte event. Napoleon did not argue. He did not plead. He began to walk toward the chamber, his boots clicking on the blood-stained obsidian. Every step was a deliberate act of uncrowning. He was stripping away the layers of his own legend, the general, the first consul, the emperor. He was leaving them behind, in the pile of rusted masks and broken mirrors. He reached the edge of the stasis field and stopped looking back at the shattered reflections of the plaza one last time. He saw the fracture of his humanity reflected in every shard, the cracks in the human spirit that he had tried to fill with his own will. "I leave you your temple, Inquisitor," Napoleon said, a faint chilling smile touching his lips. "But remember this, a temple without fire is just a tomb. You have killed the Savior to preserve the saint, but the darkness you fear is already inside your walls. You think you are erasing me, but you are only burying the one mind that knew how to navigate the abyss." He reached up and unbuttoned his blue coat, letting it fall to the floor. Underneath, he was just a man, small, tired, and profoundly alone. He stepped into the cold blue light of the stasis chamber. As the containment field surged, freezing the air around him into a crystalline cage, Napoleon Bonaparte closed his eyes. His final thought was not of glory or the eagles of France. It was of a quiet garden in a world that no longer existed, where the sun did not burn and the sky was not a wound. He chose to step into the nothingness, the void of non-existence, to ensure that his name would never be used to justify another massacre. He had tusked his own crown, choosing the peace of being forgotten over the horror of being misremembered. Vahl watched as the stasis field stabilized, locking the great captain into a state of permanent, lightless suspension. She felt a strange, cold void in her own chest, a sensation that she quickly suppressed with a prayer to the Golden Throne. She signaled to Row 9. "Begin the purge," she commanded. "Wipe the tactical logs. Delete the surveillance footage." The Bonaparte Protocol never happened. Sector 4 was lost to a standard warp breach. The hero of the Mirror Plaza does not exist. He is a ghost we have exorcised. Magos Row 9 bowed his mechanical head, his dendrites clicking as they initiated the system-wide erasure. "Acknowledged, Inquisitor. The checksum will be corrected. The anomaly will be removed. History will be restored to its proper stagnant alignment." As the lights in the plaza dimmed and the heavy blast doors began to close, the only sound left was the faint, ghostly ticking of a gold watch that had been left behind on the obsidian floor, a sound that was slowly swallowed by the eternal darkness of the vigilant spire. The silence that descended upon the Mirror Plaza was not the silence of peace, but the surgical quiet of a redacted document. The heavy blast doors sealed with a final resonant boom, locking the darkness inside. Outside, the machinery of the Imperium began its most efficient task, the erasure of truth. Legions of brain-scrubbed servitors, their biological components suppressed by heavy doses of amnesiac chemicals, descended upon the plaza with industrial incinerators and chemical scrubbers. They did not see the bodies of the rust-masked soldiers as people. They saw them as biological waste. They did not see the shattered mirrors as artifacts of a legendary duel. They saw them as jagged debris to be pulverized into dust. In the upper control spires, the data purges were even more thorough. Magos Row 9 sat encased in a throne of data conduits. His consciousness expanded across the Hive's entire network. With a series of cold binary commands, he began to overwrite the history of the last 9 days. The logistics reports that Napoleon had optimized were replaced with standard, inefficient templates. The orders to seal Sector 4 were reclassified as localized atmospheric failure due to neglected maintenance. The name Bonaparte was scrubbed from every Vox log, every tactical slate, and every prayer scroll. To the archives of the Administratum, there was no great captain, no necessary tyrant, and no shadow. There was only the grinding, mindless continuity of the Hive. Inquisitor Vahl stood on the observation deck of her black ship as it began its ascent into the toxic clouds of the planet. She looked down at the vigilant spire, which now appeared as nothing more than a rusted needle piercing the shroud of the world. Her hand rested on the report she had just finalized, a document that would be locked in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition, never to be read by any who were not of her rank. The report detailed the successful containment of a Class Omega temporal anomaly. It did not mention the man's brilliance, nor did it mention the look in his eyes when he chose to step into the stasis field. "The myth is dead," she whispered to the empty observation deck, "and the temple is safe." Yet as she stared at the burning horizon where the Chaos Fleet had once been, she felt a lingering chill. She had preserved the order of the Imperium, but she had seen the face of a different kind of survival, one that didn't rely on blind faith or mindless sacrifice, but on the terrifying potential of the human intellect. She knew that by erasing Napoleon, she had deprived the Spire of a weapon it might desperately need in the centuries to come. She had saved the soul of the city by ensuring its slow, inevitable stagnation. Deep within the data vaults of Magos Row 9's private sanctum, a single cogitator array continued to hum, shielded from the global purge by a series of encrypted subroutines. Row 9's mechanical dendrites twitched as he accessed a hidden log file, a file that had been flagged with a checksum error. In the cold, logical world of the Mechanicus, an error was a thing to be corrected or deleted. But this error was different. It was a recording of a sound that shouldn't exist, the rhythmic mechanical ticking of a gold watch. The Magos replayed the file. Tick, tick, tick. The frequency was perfect, a mathematical heartbeat that defied the chaotic resonance of the warp. Beneath the sound, there was a string of data that Row 9 could not translate, a fragment of a language from an era before the binary cant of Mars was even a dream. The machine priest's logic circuit's word. Was Napoleon Bonaparte a real man, a thought artifact of the past, or was he merely a manifestation of a junk file within the warp, a glitch in the fabric of reality that had briefly taken the shape of a conqueror? The data provided no answer. It only offered the sound of time passing in a universe that had forgotten its own beginning. On the floor of the now empty Mirror Plaza, forgotten amidst the dust and the chemical residue of the scrubbers, lay a small golden object. The servitors had missed it, their sensors tuned for larger masses of debris. It was the pocket watch, its casing scratched and dull, its glass face cracked. In the absolute darkness of the sealed hall where no light reached and no human breath stirred, the watch remained still. The great captain was gone, his legend buried under layers of imperial propaganda and redacted files. The city he had saved was already forgetting his name, returning to the comforting embrace of its own rot. But then, in the silence of the void, a sound echoed. It was faint, barely a vibration in the metal floor, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 suns. Tick. The gears within the watch, frozen by the paradox of the uncrowning, moved forward a single, infinitesimal fraction of a second.